Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation. We are here today with Carrie Schmitt, who is an occupational therapist with 24 years of experience. Carrie graduated from the Medical College of Georgia with a Bachelor in Science in Occupational Therapy, and she's currently enrolled in the OTD program at Boston University. She's a part-time therapist at STAR and also an instructor in many of our mentorship trainings. Welcome, Carrie. We're here today actually to talk about interoception. Carrie and I have spent endless hours reviewing literature, discussing new conceptualizations, how to address interoception in treatment, what role does it play with the kids that we work with who have sensory processing and integration challenges. And so why don't you tell us a little bit, Carrie, about how we got into this mess that we're in?
Well, I hope you enjoy or know how much I enjoy all of our conversations. I went back and looked at some notes and saw that about 3 years ago, I came into your office with a puzzle. I was seeing a little girl. She was about 8 or 9 years old, and she was cognitively very gifted. And so she had come to STAR, and her parents' primary concern was some volatility that they were noticing with her. And I really felt like she was just existing in this world of trepidation about her surroundings, her inner world, and everything, because there was such a discrepancy between her cognitive strength, her cognitive relative strength, and then her sensory processing challenges. And there was just a huge divide between those two. And the result was that she was white knuckling her way through every day.
Wow.
And relying on her cognition to get her through. And here she was at 8, and it was breaking down. It was no longer a strategy that was working for her. And the result was a lot of emotional volatility.
Yeah. And so where did we go with that? So how did you come to realize that it was not whatever praxis issues, or that her emotional dysregulation was not coming from maybe a modulation issue? Where did you get to these internal sensory experiences?
Yeah, that's a great question, because we know that a lot of the cases that we see, and in this little girl's case too, there wasn't great processing in praxis. For example, it wasn't like she was exhibiting perfect, practicability. And so we could have gone down that route too. But when we started to look at her, I would say overall, her sensory profile, while she was challenged with certain things like praxis or certain categories of sensory discrimination, and she may have even had a dabble of some modulation issues, it really struck me that the reason we were seeing her is because there was something about her system that was flawed. And the way that her senses were arising kind of within her, layered with this really bright cognitive mind, I got the sense through working with her and through, all the questionnaires and the parents' input, that there was a real sense of frustration because her cognition was so strong that she had figured out that she was working off of a flawed sensory system.
So I think what you're saying, though, Carrie, is that she wasn't really interpreting and discriminating the internal experiences that she was having to be able to even manage the emotions. So that while you talk about her IQ level and all of those higher cognitive processes, really on a very base level, she wasn't reading her internal cues to be able to discriminate the emotional experience she was having in daily life. Is that an accurate
It
interpretation?
is inaccurate. And I think one of the reasons that I came to talk to you about it is because I was a little puzzled by her discrimination abilities. I I thought I understood how her discrimination abilities were impacting her praxis, for
Right.
example. But what I wasn't sure was how her discrimination abilities were affecting her emotion regulation.
Right.
And I think that when we started asking the question, like, so she has all these management tools, right? Her cognitive management tools, but they're no longer working for her. So we started to say, well, how do you control emotion if you can't identify it? And how can you identify emotion if you're not experiencing it or discriminating it in your body?
Right. If you're not feeling it and you're not integrating the internal experiences to be able to put that label. I just want to interject here because I think, when we last revised the nosology that was proposed to categorize different subtypes of sensory processing and integration challenges, we put interoception under as an eighth sensory domain. And from our experiences with the literature and our sharing back and forth, what we've really realized is that it is so much broader than just, am I thirsty? Am I hungry? Do I have to use the bathroom? All of those internal visceral reactions. And then we broadened it with this perspective of the autonomic nervous system, our interpretation of the emotional experiences that we have within our body, and even to the extent where now, the skin and the skeletal muscles have been added into this expanded version where it's quite clear that this is not a single sensory domain, but rather a very intricate integration of sensory experiences from multiple internal places.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It's way more complex than I think we initially understood it to be. And the research is just supports that it's a burgeoning field of research, right? So it's not like we had the research, maybe when the nosology was revised, to understand the capacity of interoception and what it meant. But I think now with advances in brain scans and fMRIs and just the neuroscience and psychologists that are working on this, it's broadening our understanding of the complexity of interoception, that it is multidimensional, that it is complex, that it is sensation that arises both, like you were saying, from the viscera, which would be toileting and hunger and thirst and those kind of visceral senses, but also somatic senses, like you were saying, in terms of the touch and the proprioception. And so it's exciting, but it's challenging us because I think it's a broader and it's a broader, more complex system than we ever understood. And I think we had placed it in a great starting place. And it certainly is discriminative and serves in that sense. But now we understand that it's so much more. It's really an integrative capacity.
Yeah, and I think, we can go back to Ayres's writing, and certainly that ability to integrate body senses for what was called maybe body awareness or body scheme is really now been expanded into one's sense of self. And, I find the literature I've been reading too, when you think about associating this interoceptive information with external stimuli, we build that sense of self in relationship to others. That really serves as the foundation for social functioning. And I think that's another area, an avenue within which it's not just emotion regulation, right? And it's not just these visceral experiences, but it's actually laying a foundation for us, for our social participation and for our ability to experience the interactions with one another.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is emotion and it is the hunger and the toileting issues that lead us to investigate interoception. Like, I think, just in terms of the past, how we've understood it. But I love where you're going with this in terms of the idea about how important integration is in our understanding, how that piece is going to take us to the next level in terms of how we assess this and how we intervene. And I love going all the way back, to Ayers, because it really was her ideas that were saying that these sensory impulses, right, that we experience are integrated into meaning, and that meaning that we give them is what allows us to form relationships and function as an embodied self, which a lot of the literature is really starting to look at integration, interoception and how it underlies embodiment.
Right. And I think, what you were really alluding to there was the meaning making. And so the meaning making is that cognitive overlay. So the treatment that you and I have really talked about has to be bottom up and top down. We have to improve the accuracy of the internal sensory experiences. So on a physiological level, there has to be the ability to register that information, to feel it, to differentiate it, and then layer that with the cognitive piece to interpret what this means in terms of that being a positive experience, a negative experience. Flutters in your stomach are different than the tightness you might feel in your muscles when you get angry. So each of those has a label that helps to articulate and clarify the differences of what you're feeling.
Right. I think you hit on a couple really interesting things there. One is concepts, right? Like, a concept has to exist in order for the child to make sense of what they're experiencing. And that is certainly a cognitive component. There's just no way around that. Forming concepts is just happens from the earliest of our days. And it's definitely culturally and language dependent in a lot of ways. But the other piece I think that's so interesting is it's the link between having a sensation and having a perception.
Mm-hmm.
And that link is integration.
Right.
Sensory integration.
Integration and that's of the bottom up and the top down, because there's also a different layer of integration which comes from the physiological state, the visceral state, the autonomic nervous system, and whatever the somatosensory pieces of the sensory integration that then gets integrated at a higher level with the cognitive piece.
Right. And I think, it was just one of these realizations that it was like digging and saying, like, why is what we are doing and what people have done before us, why does it work? How are we affecting change? I know with this little girl that we talked about before, one of our questions was like, to change or to make progress, where do we start? Do we inform the sensory basis, right, of her experience? Or do we start working on stories and concepts and meaning? And for her, because she was over relying on her cognition already, she ended up being a very sedentary thinking child, right? Like she would gravitate towards things where she would find a lot of success, which is wonderful. But it left her with less sensory experience than a more active child.
So did your treatment focus more on enhancing those sensory experiences and then adding the cognitive component, or how did it go?
That's absolutely where we needed to start, right? Like, we just needed to go back and just have her reconnect with sensation in her body.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's where the sensory integrative components of the STAR frame of reference and how we intervene in these, you know, cases of children with sensory processing and integration challenges. Um, what we do is so effective because we place so much value on the sensory motor experiences in their, you know, in their therapies. And for her, she wasn't having a lot of sensory experiences through play, even though she was 8 years old.
Right.
And I know it sounds strange to think that you know, that in some way you have to come to therapy to learn to play, but in a lot of ways, she did. She needed to come play. Her parents needed to learn how to play with her. And in the context of relationship, this dear familial relationship, and in the context of helping her achieve arousal regulation, she was benefiting maximally from her sensory experiences. She was able to experience sensation, and then we were able to direct her attention to it. I
Right.
think it's
Well,
important to.
so I think part of what you're highlighting here is, you know, I'm thinking about the relationship piece and the regulation piece. And you have to be able to register those internal sensory experiences to be able to differentiate even internally when you're regulated or not regulated. I mean, we do this sort of automatically. You know when you need a cup of coffee. You know when you need to go out for a jog or do a yoga session, because that's what creates that internal homeostasis that allows for that maximal ability. And it's not just, and if you're not feeling it, you know, a lot of the cognitive approaches are just, okay, are you in red, green, or yellow? And they're very valuable, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but for those kids who aren't even perceiving what that means internally, they need that layer before the cognitive piece can really assist. And I think, you know, I remember a different example, and we don't have to go into too much detail, but of a girl who you talked about who made plans with a friend to go someplace and couldn't really even emotionally connect or physiologically connect with why she wanted to have that play date with that friend. You know, that she wasn't even able to store those physiological memories to be able to retrieve it and understand how it dictated her behavior.
That's right, because while she had a sensation arise within her, say when she'd previously spent time with that friend, she never got to the level of adding meaning to it, right? It was not like, you know, we don't think she had, for example, you know, a spinal cord injury where the sensation was not in fact reaching the central nervous system. I mean, I think her sensation, you know, is happening. I think the break was where she was not interpreting and layering positive meaning on that. And a little simpler example with that same teenager who did have that experience socially is ordering at restaurants.
Mm-hmm.
Was a very big problem for her family and for her. And I saw it in action because I said, hey, you know, we were going to have a goal setting meeting, she and I. I'm like, what can I get you to drink? We have Sprite. I have, you know, water. I could get you some tea. And she was just like, I don't know. And I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I'll bring a couple things back and you can pick. And her parents had said one of the things that they struggled the most with was this, I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot of, I don't know. And they were like, oh, of course you know. You're 15 years old, you know what you want. And truth is, she didn't know.
Right.
When we got into it, talking about it more and more and more, it wasn't like it wasn't like she was drinking a Sprite and then registering, gosh, that was really pleasant. I like Sprite. You know, I like cold Sprite. I like Sprite with ice in it. Or she never was like adding meaning to like that experience of this cold drink, for example. And so when a waiter would come up to her and say, what do you want? She'd be like, I don't know. I don't have any recall of adding meaning to anything on this menu that I liked.
Yeah.
I don't look at your menu think, I've had that before. I really liked that. Um, and, uh, and so, I mean, her default was to have her sister or her dad order for her, and they could kind of understand when to step in and when to do that. But I think it goes back to that integrative capacity, that she was having these experiences, um, and sensation is turned into perception and given meaning through integration,
Right,
right? And
right. And
so,
it's not just knowing, that I like things that are sweet or that are cold versus hot, or the flavors that she may prefer. I'm just trying to think of how it was beyond the qualities of the food. It was beyond, it wasn't a behavioral phenomena of, well, I don't store in memory what I like, so I can't retrieve it. It's just what you're saying. She wasn't able to identify some of the emotionally salient features that that she had towards that, which comes from, a total body experience that tells you, it allows you to make the choices that you were talking about.
yeah, it goes back to what you're saying about, like, when your body needs a yoga session. Like, I know when what would be pleasant for my body and good for my system is to sit down and have a cup of hot tea in the afternoon.
Right.
Like, it's a total body surveillance that
Right.
gives me the information that that warm cup, on a cold, snowy day would do something really positive for my system.
Right. So part of what is involved, I guess, in that integration is storing information about the salient features of an experience internally. And as you're saying, and I'm saying too, it's something that happens unconsciously. We don't put a lot of thought to it. When you get up and you're like, I'm ready for a cup of tea. And the fact that for our kids, and certainly I'm sure some adults with sensory issues, that it's not automatic, and that there's a lot of either cognitive effort that's directed or no effort at all, because they don't know even how to begin or start that evaluation of the physiological or internal mechanisms of experiences that are foundational to then adding the interpretive meaning to it.
I think that's a great
Um,
summary.
we're kind of running out of time, but what I really would love to add is, what you've come up with as your working definition for
Mhm.
interoception. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Sure. I've read so extensively on the topic. And so I'm sure that pieces and parts of this have been pulled from the best and brightest minds, on the topic. And it's, of course, a working definition. One of the things I love about learning, particularly learning alongside of everyone at STAR, is how much space we hold for the ability for things to evolve and for things to change and for research to add information to what we understand. And so right now, what I'm thinking is that interoception is sensation originating from within the body and traveling to the central nervous system. It provides a moment-to-moment physiological representation of the body's conscious and unconscious internal landscape.
And then there's another piece to that, right? Where you,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the role, like there's more, right? It's the role of interoception. It's to survey the body, and to edit the information that the interoceptive system is detecting for relevance and importance. I think it's some of that salience that we were talking about. Obviously, it'd be exhausting if we had to monitor our insulin levels, for example, or how our digestion was doing. So it really edits the information that it's giving for salience, to raise the level of importance if it needs attention. And it communicates this information to the brain, and then the brain's role is to make meaning of the incoming sensation. So if it's come up with the idea that the sensation would be considered hunger, then you know to go get something to eat. But we really do rely on the interplay of the physiological sensation that arises, or the experience that arises within our body, our awareness of that sensation, if it's, risen to the level that it's really relevant enough that we need to pay attention to it, then how we interpret it and give it meaning.
Well, it's a lot to digest, and I know that we have future opportunities to dialogue on this, and I know it's become the foundation work of your doctoral program. So I know whatever is going to come out of it is adding knowledge to all of our practices as therapists working with kids who have sensory processing and integration challenges. So thank you so much for taking the time with us today, Carrie.
Oh gosh, thanks for having me. I agree. We could have these conversations once a week
Yes.
because there's so much to uncover. And I really do hope that I'm able to add some knowledge. I certainly have stood on the shoulders of a lot of OTs who have gone before me in terms of uncovering some of this important information. And I really do think it's going to help the people that we serve.
Yeah. Great. All right. Thanks again.
Thank you.